August 1997. Kensington Palace, early morning. The light came in sideways through the tall windows, the kind of summer light that makes everything look briefly suspended. The corridor outside Diana's private apartments was quiet. The household staff had learned over years how to move through those rooms without sound, how to be present without intruding, visible without being noticed. One of them was a woman who had worked inside Kensington Palace for several years, who had dressed those rooms, maintained them, learned the particular rhythms of a household that operated simultaneously as a royal residence and the private refuge of a woman the entire world believed it knew. Diana found her in the corridor. What followed was not a formal conversation. It was not scheduled. It was the kind of exchange that happens between two people when one of them has been awake since before the light arrived and has something sitting in her chest that requires a voice, any voice, before the day begins and the performance resumes. Diana spoke for several minutes. What she said, preserved in the testimony of the woman herself, relayed to a small number of people she trusted, and documented in accounts that emerged only after Diana's death, was not what the palace version of her story would have predicted. It was not about Charles, it was not about Camilla, it was not about the divorce settlement or the HRH title or the photographers or the lawyers. It was about her sons, and beneath that, beneath everything, it was about a fear so specific, so carefully named, that the woman in the corridor said she never forgot a single word of it. We are going to come back to what Diana said, exactly what she said. But first you need to understand the summer of 1997. Because the woman who stood in that corridor in the early morning light was not the Diana the tabloids were printing. She was someone considerably more complicated, and considerably more at peace in certain ways than she had ever publicly appeared, which is what made what she feared so difficult to reconcile with everything else she had become. The summer of 1997 was, by almost every external measure, the best period of Diana's adult life. She was 36 years old. The divorce from Charles had been finalized the previous August. She was no longer Princess of Wales in the constitutional sense, no longer bound by the protocols and restrictions that had governed her public movements since 1981. She had kept Kensington Palace. She had kept her sons. She had kept against the institution's preferences, her access to the public work she had always understood as the truest part of her purpose. She had been to Angola in January, walking through minefields in a visor and protective gear, photographed beside landmine survivors. The images had moved around the world in 48 hours. Politicians had complained she was interfering in foreign policy. She had ignored them with a composure that sources close to her described as entirely genuine rather than performed. She had been to Bosnia in August. The work was continuing. She was also, for the first time in her adult life, in a relationship she had chosen freely, without institutional approval, without strategic calculation, without anyone standing in a corridor deciding whether the match served the monarchy's interests. Dodi Fayed. The relationship was new. It was complicated in the ways that relationships between people under permanent public scrutiny are always complicated. But by the accounts of those close to her friends, her private secretary, the staff at Kensington Palace who had watched her through the worst years, she was happy in a way she had not been in a very long time, and she was afraid. Not of the photographers, not of the institution, not of Charles or Camilla, or the courtiers who had spent a decade managing her out of the narrative they preferred. Something older, something more private. To understand Diana's fear, you have to go back further than the summer of 1997. You have to go back to what she had described in private recordings about her own childhood. She was born Diana Frances Spencer on July 1st, 1961, third child of John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, and Frances Roche. She grew up at Park House on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, the same grounds where the royal family gathered at Christmas, where the rituals of a world she would one day enter from a different door were performed every year within sight of her bedroom window. She was 6 years old when her mother left. Frances Spencer did not leave quietly. The marriage had been failing for years, in the way that marriages in that world failed, internally, invisibly, with the external surfaces maintained until they could not be. When she left, she took certain things with her. She did not take Diana. She did not take Diana's brother Charles or her sisters Sarah and Jane. She left 4 children behind in a house that was large and cold and suddenly, irrevocably, missing its centre. Diana had spoken about this in recordings that were later authenticated and published. She said she remembered the sound of the car leaving. She said she had stood at the window. She said she had not understood, 6 years old, whether her mother was coming back. She said, "I always felt responsible, as if I had done something that made her go. I know now that wasn't true, but a child doesn't know that. A child simply waits and doesn't understand why the waiting has no end." That sentence carried through everything that came after. Through the engagement, through the wedding, through 11 years of a marriage in which she had waited, in various rooms and various silences, for a warmth that never fully arrived, through the self-harm and the bulimia and the years of institutional pressure designed to make her believe her own perceptions were symptoms rather than observations. She had spent her life afraid of being left, and she had spent her life in equal measure afraid of doing to someone else what had been done to her. The woman in the corridor had worked near Diana long enough to understand her in the particular way that household staff understand people they serve. Not intimately, not as a friend understands, but in the accumulation of small observations, how someone moves through a room in the morning versus the evening, what they reach for when they are tired, how their voice changes when they believe they are not being watched. She had watched Diana be very many things inside those walls, had watched her be funny, genuinely, unexpectedly funny, in the way that people are funny when they have no energy left for performance and the real personality surfaces. Diana had a quick, dry, self-deprecating wit that almost never appeared in public because the public required something more elevated, more princess-shaped, and she had given them what they required. She had watched her be exhausted, in the deep way, not the physical way, the exhaustion of someone who has maintained a version of themselves for public consumption for so long that returning to the private self takes effort each time. She had watched her be present with her sons in a way that visibly, physically reorganized everything about her. William and Harry did not receive a performed version of their mother. They received the actual one, the one that laughed too loudly, that got down on the floor, that held on rather than letting go at the expected moment. And on this particular morning in the corridor, she watched Diana stop walking and start talking. Diana asked her, according to the account that was later preserved, whether she had children. She did. 2. Diana asked whether she worried about them. She said she supposed she worried about everything a mother worries about. Diana nodded at that. She looked at a point somewhere past the woman's shoulder, not inattentively but in the way of someone organizing a thought that has been sitting unsorted for some time. Then she said, "I worry that I'm going to get it wrong." Not dramatically, not with the weight of a confession, conversationally. As if this were a thing all mothers said in corridors before the day began. The woman said, "Wrong how?" And Diana said that I'll be too much for them. That they'll grow up and realize that having me as a mother made their lives harder rather than better. That the thing I am, what I became, what the world made of me, will be a weight they carry rather than something they're glad of. She paused. Then she said, "I don't want them to spend their lives protecting me. I want it to be the other way around. I want to be someone they can stand beside without it costing them something." The woman in the corridor said she did not know how to answer that. She said later that she did not think an answer was what Diana was looking for. Hold that fear for a moment, because it requires context. Diana was, by the summer of 1997, one of the most loved public figures on the planet. The Panorama interview had not diminished her. The divorce had not diminished her. The removal of the HRH title, which the palace had calculated would reduce her symbolic authority, had produced in practice the opposite effect. Freed from the formal constraints of royal protocol, she had become more present rather than less, more mobile, more visible in the work that had always been the most honest expression of who she was. The public adored her children. William and Harry were photographed at official events with the careful affection of boys who were being raised well and knew it. They were described by everyone who encountered them, teachers, family friends, household staff, as grounded, warm, capable of ordinary kindness in a context designed to produce anything but. Diana had done that. She had insisted on it. She had taken them to McDonald's and homeless shelters and theme parks and hospitals. She had taken them, carefully and age-appropriately, to see what the world outside the palace walls contained, so that when they eventually assumed their positions inside the institution, they would carry the knowledge of what those positions were actually for. She had succeeded. And still, in an early morning corridor, she was afraid that she had got it wrong. There is a particular shape to the fear of a person who was abandoned in childhood and then became, through a combination of circumstance and character, someone the world would not leave alone. Diana had been left by her mother at 6. She had been left, emotionally, systematically, through the mechanism of a marriage that had never been designed to include her as a full participant, by Charles. She had been left by friends who found the proximity to her particular kind of visibility too costly. She had been left in various quiet institutional ways by a family that had needed her publicly but not known what to do with her privately. She had responded to all of this by becoming someone who did not leave. She stayed in rooms where others withdrew. She held hands that others found difficult to hold. She sat on floors. She made phone calls at hours when the protocol of her position said she should not. Jay gave her private number to people inside hospitals who were not expected to hear from her again. She did not leave, and her deepest fear, the one she named in the corridor, the one that the woman preserved in her memory for years before she could bring herself to speak it to anyone, was not that she would be left again. It was that she had, without intending to, already left her sons, not physically, not in any way the world could see or measure, but in the way that a mother who is also a symbol, who is also a cause, who is also a narrative, who is also a global emotional event, leaves the particular, ordinary, undramatic work of simply being present. She was afraid that William and Harry had grown up beside a version of her, and that the real one, the one in the corridor, the one who got the joke before anyone else, the one who held on, had been less available than she had intended. The woman said Diana looked out of the window at some point during the conversation. The gardens at Kensington Palace were visible from that corridor. Formal, maintained, shaped by the same institutional hand that shaped everything else inside those walls. But in the early morning light, before the day's events had begun and the staff had set the grounds in order, there was a brief window, 20 minutes, perhaps 30, when the gardens looked almost unmanaged, almost like somewhere a person might simply walk without purpose. Diana looked at them for a moment. Then she said, "I think they'll be all right. I think they're stronger than I am. I think the things I was frightened of, that they would be lonely the way I was lonely. I don't think that happened. I think they know how to find people." She said it the way people say things they are mostly convinced of but are still checking. The woman said she told Diana, "They will be. You can see it in them." Diana smiled at that. Not the public smile, not the one from 1,000 photographs, the one that had been described by commentators across 30 years as luminous, radiant, devastating in its warmth. The smaller one. The one that arrived when something had been said that she was allowing herself just briefly to believe. Then she thanked the woman. And she walked back toward her apartments, and the corridor returned to its ordinary quiet. Diana died on August 31st, 1997, 12 days after that conversation. William was 15, Harry was 12. What happened to them afterward? The decades of public service, the marriages, the children, the losses and fractures and reconciliations and separations that have played out inside a family and a monarchy and a media landscape that never stopped watching, is a story that belongs to them to tell, not here. But the fear Diana named in the corridor did not come true in the way she had articulated it. Her sons have spoken about her, at length, with a specificity and an emotional directness that would not have existed had they not been given, in their most formative years, a mother who modelled that directness at considerable personal cost. William said in a documentary made to mark the 20th anniversary of her death that he still found it difficult to talk about her, that the grief did not diminish with time, that he thought about her in relation to his own children, what she would have said, how she would have held them, what she would have found funny about who they were becoming. Harry said she was the best mother in the world. He said it simply, without qualification. The woman in the corridor kept the conversation for years, not because she thought it was historically significant, not because she believed she had witnessed something that needed to be preserved for the record. She kept it the way people keep the things that have stayed with them long after the logic of keeping them has expired. Because it was true. Because it was the Diana that the archive of public images and tabloid coverage and televised interviews and palace statements, the entire vast machinery that had been pointed at this woman for 16 years, had never managed to fully capture. A woman in a corridor before the day began. Afraid of ordinary things, asking to be told that the people she loved most were going to be all right, allowing herself for 30 seconds to believe the answer, then walking back to the room and preparing for whatever came next. That is not the Diana of the fairy tale version. It is not the Diana of the tabloid version. It is not even entirely the Diana of the tabloid version. It is not even entirely the Diana of the tapes and the Panorama interview and the Morton biography, the heroic witness, the institution's most articulate critic, the woman who refused to be erased. It is something quieter than all of those, a mother, standing at a window, watching a garden she did not tend in a house that had never been fully hers, thinking about two boys she had tried, against considerable odds, to raise into people who would know how to find each other. She got that right. She did not live to know it. But the woman in the corridor knew. And now, so do you.